It was early 2022, and life in San Isidro moved at its usual, slow and steady pace. Town's cobblestone streets were lined with colorful homes, their walls painted in bright yellows, reds, and blues. Children played soccer in the dusty roads, and neighbors exchanged greetings while tending to their gardens. The aroma of freshly made tortillas and tamales filled the air, a reminder of the town's deep-rooted traditions. At the center of it all stood Iglesia del Buen Pastor, Church of the Good Shepherd. The old stone church, with its tall bell tower and stained glass windows, was the pride of the community. Every Sunday morning, the church bells rang out across the town, calling families to worship. Inside, rows of wooden pews filled quickly, and the sound of hymns echoed through the high ceilings, creating an atmosphere of peace and devotion. Reverend Samuel Hart, the church's preacher, was a man of charisma and conviction. Standing tall with piercing blue eyes and a warm smile, he had a way of making everyone feel seen and heard. His sermons were powerful and heartfelt, often bringing tears to the eyes of his congregation. People admired him not just for his faith, but for the kindness he showed outside the church walls. Samuel spent much of his time visiting families, helping with their struggles, and offering words of encouragement. He had become a trusted figure in San Isidro, someone people turned to for advice and support. But few knew much about his past, why he had come to this small town, or what secrets he carried with him. Maria Gonzalez, like many in the community, attended church faithfully every Sunday. Though she sat in the pews with her young daughter Isabella, she found little solace in her prayers, weighed down by the loneliness she felt in her marriage. Her husband, Carlos, was rarely home due to his demanding job as a construction worker. When he did come home, he was too exhausted to notice her growing unhappiness. Maria began to feel invisible, longing for someone who would listen to her and understand her pain. One Sunday after Mass, Maria approached Reverend Hart with hesitation. She asked if he could spare some time for counseling, explaining that she felt lost in her relationship with Carlos. Samuel, ever the caring preacher, agreed immediately. The sessions began as simple conversations in the church office, a small room filled with books and the soft scent of old wood. Maria shared her feelings of neglect, her struggles to keep her marriage alive, and her fears of becoming a failure as a wife. Samuel listened intently, offering her comforting words and practical advice. He spoke of patience and faith, encouraging Maria to communicate with Carlos and not to give up on her family. But as their sessions continued, the dynamic began to shift. Samuel's words weren't just about faith anymore. They felt personal, as if he truly understood her on a deeper level. For Maria, these moments of understanding became a lifeline, a reason to keep returning to the church even when she doubted her own worth. By March 2022, Maria Gonzalez had become a regular visitor to the church office. What began as counseling sessions with Reverend Samuel Hart had evolved into something deeper. Maria found comfort in Samuel's words. His empathy and understanding filled an emotional void that had been growing in her marriage. Samuel, too, felt drawn to Maria in ways he hadn't expected. At first, he justified his feelings as part of his pastoral duty, telling himself he was merely offering a struggling woman the guidance she needed. Yet, her vulnerability and beauty stirred something in him, and he couldn't deny the growing tension between them. Their private conversations became more personal. Maria opened up about her dreams, her disappointments, and the loneliness that had consumed her. Samuel responded with stories of his own struggles and doubts, revealing a more human side than Maria had ever seen. Their shared moments began to feel less like spiritual guidance and more like the beginning of something forbidden. One evening in late March, Maria stayed behind after Mass. She told Samuel she needed extra time to pray, hoping to find clarity for the emotions swirling inside her. Samuel agreed, suggesting they pray together in the church's small chapel, a quiet space lit only by flickering candles and the faint glow of stained glass. As they knelt side by side, their whispers mingled with the stillness. Maria poured her heart out, confessing her struggles with guilt and her longing for something more in life. Samuel reached out to comfort her, his hand brushing hers. In that moment, the boundaries between preacher and congregant blurred. Maria looked up at him, her eyes brimming with both gratitude and confusion. Samuel hesitated, torn between his vows and the undeniable connection he felt. But the tension between them was too strong to resist. Slowly, their hands intertwined, and before they could think of the consequences, they shared a kiss, a tender, electric moment that shattered the walls they had tried to keep between them. What followed was a night of passion in the secluded chapel. For Maria, it was the first time in years she felt truly seen, desired, and alive. For Samuel, it was a plunge into territory he had sworn to avoid, breaking every moral and spiritual code he held dear. As Maria walked home that night, a mix of emotions overwhelmed her. On one hand, she felt exhilarated, as though she had rediscovered a part of herself she thought was lost forever. Samuel had awakened feelings in her that she had buried under years of routine and neglect. But alongside her joy came an unbearable guilt. She thought of Carlos, who worked tirelessly to support their family. She thought of Isabella, her innocent daughter, who deserved a loving and stable home. And she thought of the church, the place she had always turned to for guidance, now tainted by her betrayal. Maria prayed for forgiveness, but her prayers felt hollow. The secret she now carried weighed heavily on her, even as she found herself yearning for the moments she shared with Samuel. She knew what they were doing was wrong, yet she couldn't bring herself to end it. Back at the church, Samuel sat alone in his office, his mind racing. The memory of Maria's touch and the passion they shared haunted him. He had spent years building his reputation as a moral and trustworthy leader, yet in one evening, he had risked everything. Samuel tried to pray for strength, but instead, he found himself longing for Maria. He rationalized his actions, convincing himself that their connection was special, even divinely intended. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had broken his vows, betrayed his congregation, and jeopardized his standing in the community. Despite his guilt, Samuel couldn't deny the magnetic pull Maria had on him. He resolved to see her again, unable to resist the flame they had ignited. By June 2022, Carlos Gonzalez started sensing that something was different about his wife. Maria seemed distant, often lost in her thoughts, yet she carried an uncharacteristic glow. She was more attentive to her appearance, wearing dresses she hadn't touched in years, and applying makeup, even for small errands. Carlos, always exhausted from his long hours at the construction site, initially brushed it off as Maria simply trying to feel good about herself. But the changes went beyond her appearance. Maria's behavior had shifted too. She seemed more impatient with Carlos's questions, her excuses for staying late at church becoming more frequent and vague. She smiled to herself when she thought no one was looking, yet her moments of happiness were often followed by long silences. Carlos felt a twinge of unease, but he tried to ignore it, telling himself that his wife's newfound energy was a good thing. Yet, deep down, a seed of doubt began to take root. The annual summer festival at Iglesia del Buen Pastor was one of San Isidro's most anticipated events. Families gathered in the church courtyard for food, music, and games, celebrating their tight-knit community. Carlos attended with Maria and Isabella, hoping for a rare day of family bonding. As the festivities unfolded, Carlos noticed Maria slipping away. She said she needed to help with the church volunteers, but when Carlos saw her walking toward Reverend Samuel Hart near the edge of the courtyard, his curiosity got the better of him. He followed at a distance, careful not to be seen. From behind a row of bushes, Carlos overheard snippets of their conversation. "It's getting harder to hide." This Maria's voice was soft but strained. "We have to be careful, Maria," Samuel replied. "No one can know." Carlos's heart pounded. Though their words were vague, the intimacy in their tone was unmistakable. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more painful than the last. Had his wife betrayed him? And with the preacher, no less? Carlos didn't confront them then. Instead, he withdrew into the crowd, his thoughts in turmoil. He began watching Maria more closely, his doubts growing stronger with each passing day. Around the same time, Maria began feeling nauseous in the mornings. She initially dismissed it as stress, but when the symptoms persisted, she decided to take a pregnancy test in secret. The result was positive. Maria stared at the test in disbelief, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and joy. While a part of her was thrilled by the new life growing inside her, she knew deep down that the child couldn't be Carlos's. The timing didn't match. Samuel was the father. This revelation sent Maria into a spiral of panic. The stakes of her affair with Samuel had just skyrocketed. She knew she couldn't keep the pregnancy hidden forever. Sooner or later, Carlos would find out, and the consequences could be devastating. For Maria, the pregnancy was both a blessing and a curse. She felt a profound connection to Samuel, and the thought of carrying his child brought her a strange sense of comfort. But the reality of her situation was terrifying. She was a married woman in a small, traditional town where gossip spread like wildfire. The guilt weighed heavily on her. She couldn't bear the thought of destroying her family, especially for Isabella's sake. Yet, she also couldn't imagine a future without Samuel, the man who had awakened a part of her she thought was gone forever. Maria decided to keep the pregnancy a secret for as long as she could, hoping to buy time to figure out what to do. But as the weeks went by, hiding the truth became more difficult. Her body began to change, and her emotions became harder to control. Unbeknownst to Maria, Carlos was already putting the pieces together. Her distant behavior, her glowing demeanor, and the whispered conversation he overheard all pointed to something he couldn't ignore. His suspicions consumed him, and he resolved to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. In the quiet town of San Isidro, the walls of secrecy were beginning to crack. With Maria's pregnancy adding fuel to the fire, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change their lives forever. By August 2022, Maria couldn't keep the secret any longer. She was pregnant, and she needed Samuel, the preacher, to help her. She felt hopeless and alone, but she still hoped that Samuel would step up and support her. One evening, after Carlos had gone to work, Maria met Samuel at the church. She needed to confess the truth to him. "I'm pregnant," Maria told him, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's yours." Samuel was shocked. His face turned pale as the reality hit him. He stood there, frozen, and Maria waited for him to say something, anything. "I can't be part of this," Samuel said after a long silence. "This is too dangerous for me. I can't lose everything. I have to protect my reputation." Maria's heart sank. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The man she had trusted and loved was now running away from her, afraid of the consequences. "Please, Samuel, help me," Maria begged. But Samuel, looking anxious, shook his head. "I'm sorry, Maria. I just can't," he said, walking away from her. After that night, Samuel's behavior became distant and cold. He stopped answering Maria's calls and ignored her messages. When they saw each other at church, he acted like nothing had happened. Maria felt abandoned, and she realized that Samuel wasn't going to help her. He was too scared to face the truth. The man who had once been so kind and caring had turned his back on her, and Maria was left to face the consequences alone. As days went by, Carlos began noticing that Maria was acting differently. She was distant, yet strangely happier. Something wasn't right. One evening, while Maria was in the shower, Carlos decided to look through her phone. He knew he had to find out what was going on. When he looked through her messages, he found texts between Maria and Samuel that confirmed his worst fears. The messages were loving and secretive. One text read, "Are you sure you're ready for this?" And Maria's reply, "I'm scared, but I need you." Carlos's heart broke. He couldn't believe what he was reading. His wife had been having an affair with the preacher, and now she was pregnant with his child. Anger and betrayal consumed him. That night, Carlos waited for Maria to come home. He was furious and hurt. When Maria walked in, she could feel the tension in the air. "Maria," Carlos said coldly, "we need to talk." Maria's stomach dropped. She knew something was wrong. Carlos slammed the phone on the table, showing Maria the texts. "You think I wouldn't find out?" he yelled. "You think I wouldn't know about you and him?" Maria's heart raced. "Carlos, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen this way." Carlos cut her off. "I trusted you. I worked so hard for us, for our family, and you went behind my back with him." Maria tried to explain, but Carlos was too angry to listen. His voice cracked with emotion as he shouted, "Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you talk to me?" Maria could barely speak through her tears. I don't know. I was lost. I was afraid." Carlos's rage exploded. He grabbed her by the arm. "You've made your choice, Maria," he said, shoving her away. "It's over." With that, Carlos stormed out of the house. As he left, he turned to her and said, "I'll make him pay. I'll make you both pay." By September 2022, Samuel's guilt over the affair had become unbearable. He tried to bury his conscience with prayers and scripture, hoping that his connection with God would provide him peace. But no matter how hard he prayed or sought forgiveness, the weight of his actions consumed him. The guilt over betraying Maria's trust and his role in destroying her marriage was something he couldn't escape. In quiet moments at the church, Samuel would stand before the altar, staring at the stained glass windows, searching for answers. His thoughts were filled with shame, and he knew deep down that he couldn't continue living this double life. The pressure was mounting, and the preacher had decided that he had to leave the town, start over somewhere new, far away from the people who trusted him and the scandal he had caused. But Samuel's attempt to flee didn't go unnoticed. Carlos, consumed with anger and hurt, had been watching Samuel. He had been trying to piece together everything that had happened, and when he realized that Samuel was planning to leave town, Carlos saw it as his last chance to confront him. The idea of Samuel running away without facing the consequences of his actions pushed Carlos over the edge. He could no longer let him escape. It was a dark and stormy night in September when Carlos decided to take matters into his own hands. The weather was bleak, the rain pouring heavily, and the wind howling through the trees, as if nature itself was a reflection of the turmoil inside him. Carlos knew that Samuel would be at the church, alone, as he often sought refuge there to pray. Carlos arrived at the church, drenched from the rain, his fists clenched with rage. He entered the building quietly, the heavy wooden doors creaking as they swung open. The church was eerily silent, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder. Samuel was kneeling at the altar, lost in prayer. He didn't hear Carlos approach. "You think you can just leave?" Carlos's voice boomed, cutting through the silence. Samuel looked up, startled to see Carlos standing there, his face twisted in anger. "Carlos, what are you doing here?" Samuel's voice was shaky, but he quickly tried to regain composure. He knew this was the moment everything would come to a head. "You ruined my life," Carlos shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "You destroyed my family, and now you're going to run away without facing the consequences?" Samuel stood up, taking a step back. "Carlos, please, this is not the way. I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I tried to help Maria, but I made terrible mistakes." But Carlos was beyond reasoning. The hurt, the betrayal, and the rage had clouded his mind. "I trusted you, you bastard," he yelled. "You took everything from me. You don't get to just walk away." Samuel backed away, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, trying to calm the situation. "Please, Carlos, let's talk this through. We can find a way to make this right." But Carlos wasn't listening anymore. His anger had taken over, and he was no longer able to control it. His eyes were wild, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around the church for something, anything to use. His gaze landed on a heavy brass candlestick on a nearby table, its surface gleaming in the dim light. Without thinking, Carlos grabbed the candlestick, swinging it with all his might. The blow caught Samuel by surprise. The preacher stumbled backward, but Carlos followed, his hands shaking as he raised the candlestick again. In a fit of rage, Carlos brought it down on Samuel's head with brutal force. The sound of metal hitting bone echoed through the church. Samuel's body crumpled to the floor, lifeless. Blood pooled around him, staining the cold marble floor of the altar. Carlos stood over Samuel's body, panting, his hands still gripping the candlestick. The storm raged outside, but the church was silent now, save for Carlos's labored breathing. In that moment, Carlos's mind snapped back to reality. The shock of what he had just done hit him like a freight train. He stood there, staring at Samuel's motionless body, his pulse racing. But there was no time to dwell on the act he had to get out. Carlos dropped the candlestick, the cold metal clattering against the floor. He glanced one last time at the altar, where Samuel lay, then quickly ran out of the church into the storm. He fled into the night, leaving behind the body of the man who had torn his life apart. As he disappeared into the rain-soaked streets, Carlos knew that he had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The murder was done, and now Carlos would have to live with the consequences. By October 2022, the small town was in complete shock. Reverend Samuel Hart, the trusted preacher everyone looked up to, had been found dead in a quiet area outside town. His body was discovered by a passerby, and it didn't take long for people to realize that something terrible had happened. The news spread quickly, and the entire community was stunned. How could this happen to someone they all trusted so much? Samuel had always been there to guide the people, and now he was gone. Everyone was confused and scared. The police started investigating right away, but the town still had more questions than answers. Maria couldn't stop thinking about the affair and the guilt that had been eating at her. She had betrayed her husband, and now Samuel was dead. She decided that she couldn't keep the secret anymore. She called the police and agreed to meet with them at the station. "I need to confess," Maria said nervously. "I was having an affair with Reverend Samuel Hart." Maria explained how the affair had started and how everything had gone wrong. She told the police she felt terrible about what happened, but also insisted that she didn't know who had killed Samuel. I had no idea who would hurt him, she said, tears in her eyes. I never wanted him to die. But the police weren't sure if they could believe everything, Maria said. She admitted to the affair, but they needed to know more about the murder. As the investigation went on, the police found evidence that linked Carlos to Samuel's death. They discovered Carlos's fingerprints on the weapon used to kill Samuel and found blood near the crime scene that matched Carlos. It was clear to the police that Carlos had been at the scene of the crime. They arrested him one evening at his workplace. When the news spread, the town was shocked. People couldn't believe that Maria's own husband was being accused of murder. When Maria heard the news, she felt a mix of shock and sadness. She never thought Carlos would go this far, even though he had been so angry with her affair. Now, not only had she destroyed her marriage, but Carlos had done something unthinkable. Carlos was taken into custody and would later face trial. As for Maria, she was left to deal with the consequences of her affair and the pain of knowing her husband had been arrested for murder. The once peaceful town was forever changed, and everyone struggled to understand what had happened.